At first light, a plow slowed near a frozen culvert off Route 115, its driver noticing a purse pinned by ice, tire ruts leading nowhere, and a quiet that felt wrong, the kind that makes radios click off while notebooks open and breath fogs, before anyone says what it means. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Pennsylvania in December of 1990 carried a particular weight, the kind older residents remember clearly, when snow arrived early and stayed, when Thanksgiving leftovers blurred into Christmas planning, and when local papers printed church bake sales beside reports of layoffs and small crimes that felt manageable. The woman connected to that purse was 22-year-old Emily Carter, a nursing assistant who rented a second-floor apartment above a closed barber shop in the borough of Weatherly. Emily had brown hair cut practical, a cautious smile in photographs, and a routine built around long shifts, modest plans, and drives home along familiar roads. She was reported missing 2 days before Christmas Eve, after failing to show for a double shift and not answering her phone. The initial assumption, recorded in a short police memo, leaned toward a voluntary absence, a young adult traveling or staying with friends for the holidays. That assumption faded quickly as the cold pressed in and the calendar narrowed. The purse found near the culvert contained Emily's wallet, her identification, a receipt dated December 20th from a grocery on Broad Street, and a set of keys without her car fob. The purse itself showed no obvious damage, just the damp stiffness of leather exposed to snow. State police secured the area before sunrise, marking tire impressions that cut across the shoulder and disappeared onto plowed pavement. A search followed the culvert downstream where ice choked the water and reeds bent under frost. There was no sign of Emily there, but the location anchored the case, shifting it from a missing person to a potential crime. The weather complicated everything. Snow softened edges, refroze overnight, and erased what little December light revealed. Emily's last confirmed movements were pieced together from time-stamped purchases, a gas station camera, and a coworker's statement. She left work at 11:12 p.m. on December 20th, stopped for fuel on Route 93, and was seen driving north in her blue sedan. She never arrived home. Her car was not in her usual spot the next morning. Flyers went up on telephone poles in diners, and on the courthouse bulletin board, her photograph copied until the edges blurred. Local radio mentioned her name between weather updates. The tone was restrained, careful not to inflame, but attentive enough that men who read the morning paper noticed. The investigation moved methodically. Detectives canvassed her apartment, finding wrapped gifts labeled in neat handwriting, a half-decorated artificial tree, and an answering machine with messages from her mother about holiday plans. There were no signs of a struggle. Bank records showed no unusual activity. Friends described Emily as reliable, cautious, not prone to disappearing. A former boyfriend was interviewed and cleared by travel records and corroborated timelines. The early days produced more questions than answers, and the holidays pressed on regardless, bringing quiet streets and closed offices that slowed responses. On December 27th, a hunter walking state game lands 3 miles from the culvert noticed disturbed snow near a tree line. The discovery that followed was handled without spectacle. Emily Carter was found fully clothed, positioned by terrain rather than intent, with no obvious external injuries visible through winter layers. The coroner noted exposure and trauma indicators requiring autopsy, and the body was transported under standard procedure. The scene yielded fibers inconsistent with Emily's clothing, a partial footwear impression, and trace soil that did not match the immediate area. The findings suggested relocation. The autopsy, completed after New Year's Day, indicated cause of death consistent with blunt force trauma and exposure, with time of death estimated within hours of her disappearance. There was no evidence of prolonged captivity. Toxicology was negative. The results narrowed the window and sharpened the focus on the roadside location where the purse had been discarded. Investigators reviewed winter maintenance logs, traffic stops, and service vehicles operating that night. A timeline reconstruction placed Emily on Route 115 between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, a stretch known for limited lighting and wide shoulders. Witness interviews resumed with renewed urgency. A truck driver recalled seeing a blue sedan pulled over with hazard lights and a dark pickup behind it. A nearby resident reported hearing engines idling late, but assumed it was snow removal. These fragments were recorded, cross-checked, and set aside when they failed to converge on a specific suspect. The case cooled as months passed, then years. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and stored in a climate-controlled room that smelled faintly of paper and dust. Emily's parents attended hearings about unsolved cases, their faces familiar to clerks. Each December brought renewed calls to the department and brief mentions in the press, respectful but restrained. In 2008, a statewide review of cold cases prompted re-examination of evidence using updated forensic methods. Fibers recovered from Emily's clothing were retested, and soil analysis benefited from expanded databases. A partial profile was developed from trace material under her nails, insufficient for identification at the time, but suitable for future comparison. The footwear impression, once too general, was reanalyzed and linked to a specific work boot model popular in the early 90s among construction and municipal workers. The breakthrough came in 2018 when a separate assault investigation in Luzerne County produced a DNA sample from a man named Robert Hayes, a former highway contractor with a history of minor offenses and a pattern of roadside stops under the pretense of assistance. Hayes had worked winter maintenance routes near Route 115 in 1990. His DNA matched the partial profile from Emily Carter's case within accepted statistical certainty. Investigators quietly built the case, reviewing Hayes's employment records, fuel logs, and contemporaneous statements. A search warrant recovered boots consistent with the impression, preserved among stored belongings. Robert Hayes was arrested in November 2019, just before Thanksgiving, without incident. The charges reflected the evidence, careful and specific. During trial, prosecutors presented a clear sequence: opportunity, forensic linkage, and corroborating witness accounts. The defense challenged timelines and memory, but records held. In February 2020, Hayes was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The courtroom was quiet at the reading of the verdict, the kind of quiet that follows long waiting rather than sudden shock. The aftermath was subdued. Emily Carter's name returned to the paper, this time beside closure. Her parents issued a brief statement thanking investigators. Evidence was returned to storage or destroyed per policy. Each December, a small wreath appears near the culvert, placed without ceremony. The road remains busy, the snow still comes, and the files, now marked solved, rest where they belong. January settled over Carbon County with a flat gray sky that seemed to press against rooftops and courthouse steps, and with it came the slower work that follows a confirmed homicide. The urgency of the search phase gave way to methodical reconstruction, the kind of work that fills binders and tests patience. Investigators returned to Route 115 repeatedly, measuring distances, mapping sightlines, and reviewing winter maintenance schedules. The road curved gently through wooded sections before opening toward town, a place drivers knew well enough to feel comfortable stopping, especially during storms. Emily Carter's sedan was still missing, and its absence complicated the narrative, leaving a gap that could not be filled by assumptions. The vehicle was eventually located in early February in a long-term parking area outside a closed ski lodge, partially buried under snow pushed aside by plows. The car doors were locked, there was no visible damage, and the interior held nothing unexpected. No blood, no signs of a struggle, just a faint smell of damp upholstery, and a parking receipt dated December 21st tucked into the console. The location suggested deliberate placement, a spot unlikely to draw attention during winter, yet close enough to main roads to allow easy access. The odometer reading aligned with the known route, reinforcing the timeline already established. Processing the vehicle produced limited but important findings. Fibers consistent with those found on Emily's clothing appeared on the driver's side floor mat, along with soil-matching samples taken near the culvert. These were subtle confirmations rather than revelations, but they tightened the case's internal logic. The car's discovery also closed a loop for Emily's family, removing the uncertainty of where it had gone and replacing it with the harder knowledge of intent. As winter turned toward spring in 1991, interviews continued. State police revisited every person who might have had reason to be on that stretch of road late at night. Snowplow operators, delivery drivers, volunteer firefighters, and utility workers were all questioned. Most offered routine accounts, times logged, routes driven, nothing out of place. A few recalled seeing vehicles pulled over, hazards blinking, a common enough sight in December storms. None could provide license plates or faces. Memory, already fragile, faded further with time. The local press maintained a steady but restrained interest. Articles appeared on anniversaries and during holiday seasons, often paired with reminders to drivers about winter safety. Emily Carter's name became familiar in a way that was both respectful and distant, a shorthand for an unresolved wrong. For older readers, the case lingered like an unfinished sentence, something remembered when passing the courthouse or the diner where flyers once hung. Within the department, the case was neither abandoned nor actively pursued at full speed. It moved into the cold case unit, its boxes labeled and shelved but not forgotten. Detectives rotated, each reviewing the file with fresh eyes before returning it to storage. The evidence list remained short and precise, a testament to careful initial work even when answers were scarce. Every few years, a new technique or database prompted a brief revival, a retesting, a renewed comparison that ended without match. Emily's parents aged visibly through those years, attending memorial services and meeting quietly with investigators when updates were available. They marked holidays differently, setting aside time to visit the place where she was found, leaving flowers that wilted quickly in winter air. Their persistence was measured, never accusatory, grounded in the belief that the truth existed somewhere within the records. The shift toward resolution began indirectly, driven by unrelated crimes that shared procedural similarities. In the mid-2000s, Pennsylvania State Police began consolidating DNA evidence from older cases into a centralized system. Partial profiles that once seemed unusable gained new potential as databases expanded. Emily Carter's case was flagged again, not because of a new lead, but because technology had finally caught up to the questions it posed. The forensic review extended beyond DNA. Soil samples were re-examined using updated geographic comparison tools, narrowing possible source areas. Fibers were cataloged against manufacturing records, confirming production runs common to certain work uniforms in the late 1980s. The footwear impression, once dismissed as too generic, was matched to a specific tread pattern discontinued in 1992. Each element alone remained circumstantial, but together they formed a clearer silhouette of the person investigators sought. Despite these advances, progress was incremental. Years passed between meaningful updates. Detectives documented their findings meticulously, aware that any future prosecution would depend on clarity and restraint rather than dramatic turns. The goal was not to build a story, but to assemble facts that could withstand scrutiny decades later. In 2017, a routine audit of assault cases in neighboring counties brought an unexpected connection. A suspect arrested for an attempted roadside assault had a history that echoed details from Emily Carter's file. He targeted women driving alone at night, often during winter months, using the pretense of assistance. His name, Robert Hayes, appeared nowhere in the original investigation, largely because he had lived transiently at the time, working seasonal contracts and moving frequently. When Hayes's DNA was entered into the system following his arrest, it triggered a tentative match with the partial profile preserved from Emily's case. The statistical confidence was not sufficient on its own, but it was enough to reopen the file with urgency. Investigators approached carefully, aware of the stakes and the years that had passed. They began by reconstructing Hayes's movements in December of 1990, relying on employment records, pay stubs, and testimony from former supervisors. Those records placed Hayes on winter maintenance duty along Route 115 during the exact week Emily disappeared. Fuel logs showed his truck active late into the night on December 20th, consistent with snow conditions reported that evening. Further interviews revealed that Hayes often worked alone and had been reprimanded once for deviating from assigned routes. None of this constituted proof, but it aligned too closely to ignore. Surveillance and background checks followed, conducted quietly to avoid alerting Hayes prematurely. Investigators collected discarded items to obtain additional DNA samples, ensuring proper warrants and chain of custody. When the comparison results returned, they strengthened the match, reducing the margin of doubt. The footwear evidence gained new relevance when photographs from Hayes's past showed him wearing boots consistent with the tread identified years earlier. By the time the case was presented to the district attorney, it rested on a foundation built slowly and deliberately. There were no confessions, no dramatic revelations, just a convergence of evidence that pointed in one direction. The decision to proceed reflected confidence in the process rather than pressure for closure. For those who had carried Emily Carter's name through decades of paperwork and memory, it marked the beginning of the end of waiting, even as winter once again approached. The renewed investigation advanced with a caution shaped by time. Every step was documented, reviewed, and cross-checked, mindful that decades separated the crime from the courtroom. Detectives revisited physical locations with modern mapping tools, overlaying old photographs with current satellite imagery. Route 115 had been widened in places, shoulders regraded, but the curvature and sightlines remained recognizable. The culvert where Emily Carter's purse had been found was still there, reinforced with concrete, traffic flowing past without pause. Measurements taken anew confirmed that a vehicle could pull over unnoticed on a winter night, shielded briefly from passing headlights by the bend in the road. Attention turned to Robert Hayes's history in greater depth. Born in the mid-1950s, he fit comfortably into the demographic that now followed the case through newspapers and evening broadcasts. His work life was inconsistent, marked by seasonal employment, brief stints with contractors, and periods of unemployment. Records showed minor arrests for disorderly conduct and a single charge related to an assault allegation in the early 2000s that never went to trial. Nothing in his past suggested a sophisticated offender, but it suggested familiarity with roads, late hours, and isolation. Investigators reconstructed Hayes's movements in the weeks surrounding December 20th, 1990. Old payroll systems, archived on microfilm, confirmed his assignment to snow removal routes that intersected with Emily's likely path home. A former supervisor, now retired, recalled Hayes as competent but prone to taking unscheduled breaks, a detail noted in a performance review. Fuel receipts showed purchases consistent with extended driving that night. The pattern placed him within proximity, without relying on memory alone. The missing element remained Emily's sedan. Although its discovery had closed some questions, it also raised others. Why that location? Why that timing? A renewed forensic review of the car focused on areas previously considered unremarkable. Using enhanced lighting and collection techniques unavailable in 1991, technicians recovered additional fibers from the trunk lining and trace material from the door seals. These samples were preserved, cataloged, and compared to items associated with Hayes. The results did not introduce new profiles but reinforced consistency across evidence sets. Witness statements were revisited with care. People interviewed decades earlier were contacted again when possible, not to challenge their recollections, but to clarify recorded details. Memory had faded, but written notes remained. A truck driver's account of a dark pickup behind a blue sedan was re-examined against Hayes's vehicle history. Records confirmed he owned a dark-colored pickup during that period, later sold and scrapped. Registration data placed it in service through early 1991. The alignment was circumstantial, but it filled another gap in the narrative. As the case strengthened, investigators faced the challenge common to cold cases approaching resolution, balancing transparency with restraint. Media interest increased quietly after court filings signaled movement. Local papers ran short updates noting a renewed push, careful to avoid speculation. Older readers recognized the name Emily Carter immediately, while younger residents encountered it for the first time, framed by the passage of years and the persistence of record-keeping. The legal strategy focused on presenting a timeline that required no leaps. Prosecutors outlined a sequence beginning with Emily's departure from work, her stop for fuel, the likely roadside encounter, the relocation of her purse, the concealment of her body, and the deliberate parking of her vehicle. Each step was supported by physical evidence, records, or corroborated witness accounts. The narrative avoided conjecture, leaning instead on probability grounded in fact. Hayes was brought in for questioning under standard procedure, informed of the investigation's scope. He denied involvement, offering vague explanations for his whereabouts that could not be substantiated. His statements were recorded, preserved, and compared against established timelines. Discrepancies were noted but not dramatized. The goal was consistency, not confrontation. Search warrants were executed on properties connected to Hayes, including a storage unit he had maintained for years. Inside were personal effects, tools, and clothing from different periods of his life. Among them were work boots matching the model linked to the impression found near Emily's body, where patterns aligned with archived photographs from the early 1990s. The boots were seized, documented, and submitted for comparison. The findings did not stand alone, but they reinforced the cumulative weight of evidence. Throughout this phase, Emily Carter's family was kept informed through formal channels. Updates were factual and measured, avoiding promises. For her parents, now elderly, the process reopened old wounds even as it offered clarity. They attended meetings at the district attorney's office, listening as timelines were explained and evidence summarized. Their responses were restrained, shaped by decades of waiting rather than immediate emotion. By late 2019, the case reached a threshold. Prosecutors determined that the evidence met the standard required to file charges. An arrest warrant was issued, executed without incident at Hayes's residence. The timing, just before Thanksgiving, was noted in local coverage. framed as a sober development rather than a dramatic turn. Hayes was taken into custody, processed, and held pending trial. Pretrial proceedings moved deliberately. Defense motions challenged the admissibility of decades-old evidence, questioning chain of custody, and the reliability of partial DNA profiles. Each challenge was addressed through documentation and expert testimony, outlining preservation methods and statistical confidence. The court rulings favored inclusion, citing meticulous record-keeping and advances in forensic science. As the trial date approached, the community's attention sharpened. Older residents recalled where they had been in 1990, how the winter had felt, how Emily Carter's face had looked on flyers. The courthouse became a focal point, not of spectacle but of quiet anticipation. Proceedings unfolded without theatrics. Evidence was presented in sequence. Witnesses testified to records and procedures. Experts explained findings in plain terms. The jury deliberated with the benefit of clarity rather than emotion. When the verdict was returned, it reflected acceptance of the methodical case laid before them. Robert Hayes was found guilty on all counts related to Emily Carter's death. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines, resulting in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The decision was delivered calmly, recorded in transcripts that would outlast the moment. In the weeks that followed, the case receded from headlines. Emily Carter's name appeared once more in print, this time alongside words like resolved and accountability. Her family issued a brief statement acknowledging the investigators and the court. There were no celebrations, only a sense of conclusion. Evidence was archived according to policy, some items returned, others retained. Winter returned to Carbon County as it always had. Snow fell along Route 115, plows moved through the night, and drivers pulled over when they needed help. The difference now lay in the records, in the files marked closed, and in the knowledge that a question carried for nearly 30 years had been answered through patience, procedure, and an insistence on facts over time. After the verdict, the legal process entered its final, quieter phase, one that rarely draws attention but carries lasting significance. Sentencing documents were filed, appellate timelines outlined, and the formal judgment entered into the state record. Robert Hayes was transferred to a state correctional institution, his name added to a register that would now follow him rather than the roadways he once worked. There was no outcry, no public demonstration, only a subdued acknowledgement that a long-pending matter had reached its lawful end. For investigators, closure did not arrive with a single moment. It unfolded gradually, through administrative steps and reflective review. The cold case unit conducted an internal assessment, documenting which elements had held value over time and which had stalled progress. Emily Carter's case became a reference point in training materials, cited for the importance of preserving even the most limited evidence. Partial profiles, fiber samples, and footwear impressions, once considered marginal, were recognized as decisive when paired with patience and evolving technology. The district attorney's office archived transcripts, exhibits, and rulings, ensuring accessibility for any future review. Though appeals were anticipated as a procedural matter, the evidentiary foundation remained intact. Defense filings focused on the age of the case rather than disputing the factual links, and subsequent motions were denied in written opinions that emphasized lawful collection and continuity of custody. Each ruling reinforced the finality of the outcome. Media coverage tapered off quickly. A few follow-up articles summarized the conviction and sentencing, framed by reminders of the original disappearance nearly 3 decades earlier. The tone remained restrained, consistent with local reporting traditions. There were no retrospective specials, no dramatic reenactments. For readers who had followed the case since 1990, the resolution felt less like a revelation and more like a long-deferred answer finally delivered. Emily Carter's family navigated the aftermath privately. They declined extended interviews, choosing instead to mark the conclusion in personal ways. Court records note their presence at sentencing, seated quietly, attentive but composed. In a short written statement released through the prosecutor's office, they acknowledged the investigators who had worked the case across generations and expressed relief that Emily's name was no longer attached to the word unsolved. There was no mention of forgiveness or anger, only acknowledgement. The physical places tied to the case remained unchanged in appearance. The culvert off Route 115 continued to channel runoff beneath the road, indistinguishable from countless others across the state. Drivers passed without slowing, unaware of its history unless reminded by an occasional wreath placed in December. The wooded area where Emily was found showed signs of seasonal growth and clearing, the land indifferent to memory. These sites existed now only as coordinates in files and recollections, carried by those who knew. Within the state police archives, Emily Carter's case file was reclassified. Boxes once marked active cold case were relabeled solved, their contents preserved for historical and legal purposes. Digital records were updated, cross-referenced with DNA databases and sentencing outcomes. The administrative act was simple, but it carried weight for those who understood how long the designation had remained unchanged. The case also influenced policy. In the years following the conviction, Pennsylvania expanded funding for cold case reviews, citing successes achieved through forensic reinvestment. Emily Carter's case was mentioned in legislative hearings as an example of delayed but attainable justice. The emphasis was not on punishment but on accuracy, on the ability of the system to correct unanswered questions when given time and resources. For older residents of Weatherly and surrounding towns, the resolution prompted reflection. Conversations in diners and church halls recalled the winter of 1990, the missing flyers, the uneasy sense that lingered through that season. Many remembered where they had been when Emily disappeared, how the holidays felt muted by uncertainty. The conviction did not erase those memories, but it reframed them, allowing a narrative that ended rather than one that trailed off. The investigation's procedural nature stood in contrast to popular notions of crime solving. There were no dramatic confessions, no sudden breakthroughs driven by chance. Instead, the case moved forward through incremental validation, the accumulation of small, verifiable facts. For a demographic accustomed to patience, to waiting out storms and seasons, this approach resonated. It reflected a belief that persistence mattered more than spectacle. Robert Hayes's name faded from local mention after sentencing. He became an inmate number, his daily movements governed by routine rather than roads. Appeals were filed and denied in predictable fashion, their language technical and restrained. The legal system absorbed him as it does others, without ceremony. The focus remained on the crime rather than the man, consistent with the documentary record. As years passed beyond the conviction, Emily Carter's story settled into a different place within the community. It was no longer cited as a warning or an open wound, but as an example of eventual accountability. Law enforcement trainings referenced it briefly, emphasizing evidence preservation and intergenerational case management. New investigators learned her name alongside others, part of a lineage of cases that shaped practice. Seasonal markers continued to frame memory. Each Thanksgiving brought reflections on family gatherings interrupted long ago. Each Christmas carried echoes of a young woman who never returned home with gifts wrapped and plans made. Each new year underscored the passage of time and the rarity of resolution after so many turns of the calendar. These associations remained personal rather than public, held by those who remembered the original winter. The quiet aftermath extended beyond individuals to institutions. The courthouse resumed its routine rhythm, cases heard and decided without reference to the past. The road crews worked winter storms, logging routes and hours with digital precision unknown in 1990. Technology advanced, databases expanded, and the lessons drawn from Emily Carter's case informed systems designed to prevent future delays. In the end, the story did not conclude with relief or celebration, but with order restored. A question that had lingered across decades was answered within the bounds of law. Records reflected truth as best it could be established. The name Emily Carter rested now in a file marked complete, her story preserved not through dramatization but through documentation. For those who followed it from the beginning, that completeness mattered. It meant that time, though long and unforgiving, had not erased responsibility. The final phase of the case unfolded without ceremony, marked more by paperwork than public moments. In early spring, appellate deadlines passed quietly, motions denied in written orders that referenced statutes, precedents, and the careful handling of evidence. With each filing resolved, the conviction of Robert Hayes settled into permanence, no longer provisional, no longer pending. The system, slow and exacting, had finished its work. For the investigators who inherited the case late in their careers, the ending carried a professional weight that did not translate easily into words. Reports were closed, supervisory reviews completed, and recommendations entered into departmental archives. The Carter file became instructional material, cited in seminars for its demonstration of continuity across decades. Younger officers studied the margins, learning how small observations, preserved correctly, could outlast careers and technologies alike. Emily Carter's name continued to appear in records with precision. Birth date, age at death, residence, employment, and circumstances were summarized without embellishment. The language was deliberate, restrained, consistent with the tone that had guided the investigation from its reopening through trial. There was an understanding that accuracy was the final respect owed to her. In Weatherly, life resumed its familiar rhythm. Morning traffic passed the courthouse square, trucks idled at intersections, and the local paper returned to covering zoning disputes and school board meetings. The story no longer occupied front pages. Instead, it existed as shared knowledge, recalled occasionally when winter storms closed roads or when holiday lights appeared earlier than expected. Emily's parents, now in their late years, adjusted to a different kind of absence. The long stretch of not knowing had ended, replaced by certainty that carried its own weight. They organized personal belongings preserved for decades, deciding what to keep and what to let go. Letters from investigators, court notices, and clippings were placed into labeled folders. The act was quiet, methodical, and deeply final. The legal outcome was recorded formally in state registries. Robert Hayes entered the correctional system under a life sentence, his movements documented, his appeals exhausted. There were no further hearings of consequence. His name appeared only in administrative updates, detached from the community he once moved through anonymously. The law had drawn its boundary and held. As time passed, the case influenced broader practice. Cold case funding models cited it as evidence that delayed justice remained viable. Grants supported evidence digitization and DNA backlog reduction, informed by lessons learned from files like Emily Carter. The emphasis was practical rather than symbolic, focused on preserving options for cases still waiting. Each December, the season returned with its familiar signals. Thanksgiving gatherings filled kitchens, Christmas trees appeared in windows, and New Year's Eve brought the turning of calendars. For those who remembered 1990, the holidays carried an added layer of reflection. The knowledge that Emily's final days occurred within that season sharpened memory without overwhelming it. The calendar no longer marked uncertainty, but remembrance. The roadways central to the case remained in use, maintained and resurfaced as needed. Route 115 bore the signs of time, patched and repainted, its shoulders widened to meet modern standards. The culvert where the purse had been found blended into infrastructure, unnoticed by drivers focused on weather and schedules. Only those who knew the history understood its significance, and even then, it demanded no attention. Within law enforcement circles, the case was discussed sparingly. It served as an example rather than a story, a reminder that restraint and documentation mattered more than narrative. There were no hero figures, no single moment that resolved everything. The outcome belonged to process, to the accumulation of verified detail over years. Emily Carter's memory settled into a quieter place. It lived in family recollections, in archived files, and in the institutional knowledge of those who worked the case. There were no memorials beyond personal gestures, no annual ceremonies. The absence of spectacle felt appropriate, aligned with the tone that had defined the investigation and its resolution. The community's response reflected that same restraint. Conversations acknowledged the conviction, then moved on. There was no appetite for revisiting the pain publicly. Closure in this context meant the ability to stop asking questions rather than the erasure of loss. People accepted that some events leave marks that fade but do not disappear. In the end, the Pennsylvania 1990 cold case resolved not with a dramatic turn, but with order restored through lawful means. Evidence was tested, records verified, responsibility assigned, and consequences imposed. The passage of time had not diminished the obligation to seek truth, nor had it excused its delay. The system had responded as designed, imperfectly but persistently. Emily Carter's life was acknowledged as more than a case number, yet never exaggerated beyond fact. She was a young woman with plans interrupted, remembered through accuracy rather than myth. The final record reflected that balance, closing the file without closing memory. As another winter settled over Carbon County, snow fell along familiar routes, plows worked through the night, and radios carried routine updates. The season looked much like others before it. The difference lay quietly beneath the surface, in a question answered, a file completed, and a community allowed at last to move forward. The investigation's conclusion also reshaped how past decisions were viewed, not as failures but as reflections of their time. In 1990, resources were limited, databases fragmented, and communication slower. Officers relied on notebooks, film photographs, and personal familiarity with terrain. The fact that evidence survived intact through those constraints became part of the case's legacy, illustrating continuity rather than deficiency. Training sessions incorporated these lessons without fanfare. Slides showed scanned reports, evidence labels, and chain of custody logs. Instructors emphasized habits rather than heroics, reminding recruits that diligence often mattered decades later. Emily Carter's case appeared briefly, identified by year and county, its relevance rooted in practice. The records also documented missteps, acknowledged internally and addressed through policy. Leads that went cold, assumptions made early, and delays caused by weather or staffing were analyzed carefully. The purpose was not blame, but refinement, ensuring future investigations would benefit from experience rather than repeat it. For the community, the case subtly altered trust in institutions. Not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. The idea that answers could emerge after decades reinforced confidence in procedure over speed. Older residents, accustomed to long timelines and seasonal rhythms, recognized the value of endurance mirrored in the investigation's arc. Emily Carter's story was sometimes mentioned in private conversations between parents and children, framed as a reminder rather than a warning. It spoke to vulnerability on winter roads and the importance of caution, but also to the reach of accountability. The emphasis rested on awareness, not fear. The quiet resolution contrasted with the noise that often surrounds crime narratives elsewhere. There were no documentaries filled with speculation, no reenactments exaggerating events. Instead, the record stood on its own, accessible to those who sought it, complete and unadorned. Over time, even the investigators most closely involved moved on. Retirements came, offices changed, and new cases demanded attention. What remained was documentation, precise and durable. The system depended on that continuity, trusting paper and digital trails to carry meaning forward. Emily Carter's case ultimately affirmed a simple principle valued by many who followed it closely. Facts matter. Time complicates them, but does not erase them when care is taken. The investigation honored that principle, allowing evidence to speak when circumstances finally permitted. As years continue to pass, the story will age further, becoming reference rather than memory. Files will be accessed less frequently, names less immediately recognized. Yet the resolution will remain intact, preserved in rulings and records, immune to fading recollection. For those who measure time in seasons, the case's end aligned naturally with winter's close. Snow receded, roads cleared, and daylight lengthened. The cycle continued, unchanged, carrying forward a conclusion reached through patience rather than haste. The Pennsylvania 1990 cold case now rests where it belongs, within completed dockets and settled law. Its significance lies not in drama, but in demonstration. It shows what persistence can achieve when guided by procedure, integrity, and respect for truth. In the quiet ledger of resolved cases, Emily Carter's name occupies a single line, dated and verified. Behind it stands a community, an investigation, and a season remembered. The answer arrived late, but it arrived complete, carrying with it the calm certainty that comes only when questions finally stop. It reinforces the idea that accountability is not limited by calendars, that records endure, and that careful work done in silence can, even after decades, restore balance without spectacle or excess. That measured ending defines this case, closing the year, the record, and the long wait with restraint and finality appropriate to the truth established. It stands as resolution, not redemption, and as an ending shaped by law, time, and patience rather than emotion. In that balance, the story concludes. Quietly, completely, and without unanswered questions remaining at the end of winter in Pennsylvania history, as recorded officially permanently.